Husband: I got my girlfriend pregnant, so I'm divorcing you. You were the one that was infertile, weren't you, lol? I showed him my test results. I got my new girlfriend pregnant, so I'm divorcing you. After years of no luck when it came to conceiving a child, and just as I was finally getting tested to see if I had any problems, my husband confronted me with divorce documents. What? You're new? What does that mean? I was so upset, but he went on to reveal the brutal truth. For the very reason that I was infertile, he had started having an affair with a woman who also turned out to be his childhood friend and got her pregnant. I was stunned by this unbelievable story. But later on, I found something out about my husband that would change everything. I was going to make his life hell on earth, and to do so, I offered him a piece of paper. This is a story of how everything doesn't necessarily go to plan when it comes to married couples. And while the possibility of conceiving children may prove to be difficult, with the right amount of patience and cooperation between husband and wife, there's always a chance. You'll see how my dastardly husband did the exact opposite of this, and how his selfish actions, backed by his family, were met with public scandal. My name is Frida, and I'm a 30-year-old housewife. My husband Dakarai is 35 years old, and he took over his family's company a few years prior to this story, and was working hard as the president. Dakarai was born and raised in the States, but his roots can be traced back to Mali, in Africa, where one of his ancestral fathers founded a business that oversaw the mining and processing of rare metals. His grandfather immigrated to the States after attempting to change the business into one that managed real estate instead, and after establishing success in Washington, put down roots. Dakarai had always been the heir to inherit the business from his father before him, and I'd known he was going to be when we first started dating. But I didn't love him for his money. I didn't really care for that. He had a very jovial, jolly personality, and the fact that he would make me laugh so hard I literally peed every time we were on a date. Someone with such a positive outlook on life was so admirable to me, and I was always so happy with him. We had been married for 3 years, but we'd been together for 5 if you included our dating period, and our marriage had been good, but a crisis arose that threatened the strength of our love. The crisis was that we were unable to conceive any children together. I got married when I was 27 years old, and at the time I had no doubt in my mind that we would eventually have children because I was still young. Dakarai also wanted to spend the first year together, as newly wedded husband and wife, so he was not looking for a child just yet, and I thought that if he did not want a child yet, it was fine with me. However, after a year, when I was 28 years old, he told me that he started thinking about wanting to have children. The desire to have children was as strong as ever, and when he told me that he now wanted to have children after a year or so being together, I was honestly pleased. I started to be more careful of myself in order to have a baby by the time I was 30. I also had the admittedly stupid and outdated idea that I had to have a baby by the time I was 30. Otherwise, I would be more prone to menstrual problems or childbirth issues. No mother should ever be cautious of the well-being of herself and of her baby, and I wanted to have a pregnancy as risk-free as possible. At the age of 29, I started to get concerned and tried to do my best in my own way, such as taking measures to maintain a healthy basic body temperature, taking supplements, being careful with my diet, but still, there was no sign of conception. Every day, when the monthly you-know-what came around, I would get depressed and buy a pregnancy test to check if I was pregnant, only to find out every time that it was negative. If I didn't take more measures, I would turn 30 before I knew it. The stress of being in such a hurry, and the pressure of not seeming able to conceive a child yet caused my menstrual cycle to be disrupted in my 3rd year of marriage to Dakarai, which in turn led to a snowballing effect of doom by making it even harder to get pregnant. I thought to myself, I can't do this on my own. I ought to see a specialist to take a look at this. With this in mind, I asked my husband if he would be willing to undergo a fertility test with me. That's when things took a drastic downturn because he responded, "Infertility is always caused by the woman. You're not saying it's my fault, are you?" His tone was very aggressive, and what with the height difference and how deep his voice was, this moment was extremely stressful for me. "It's not like that, honey. You're just not trying hard enough, and you think doubting me and getting me to test fertility with you is going to make you feel better about the situation, eh? I was shocked when Dakarai turned out to be so uncooperative. But considering the situation from his point of view, it may have been a blow to his pride to say that he might be the cause of our fertility problems. He took over his family's company at a relatively young age, mostly because of his father's deteriorating health, and being the president of a company is not an easy job, and one that requires a certain amount of pride. Therefore, Dakarai is a very proud man. I felt sorry. I had provoked him, and I had not been considerate enough of his standing, but from that time on, my husband's criticism of me regarding infertility became ever more brutal. Whenever he came home, aspersions along the lines of, "You can't even have children, you damn failure. And what's fricking worse, you can't even do your own housework. Because of you, my relatives keep complaining to me." He began to lash out at me, in the worst-case scenarios. I got a call from Mio and Baba today, and guess what? They asked me a lot of questions about the boy who's going to be the heir to the company. What do you want me to do when I'm doing everything I can, eh? It's all because you're fricking infertile that their trust in me is going down. He started blaming me for all the trouble he was having with his parents, who were increasing the pressure when it came to an heir. I'm trying too, Dakarai. That's why I'm going to get a checkup at an OBGYN. Huh? Why are you going to the hospital? I had told him that I wanted to go to the hospital a couple of times before, and needless to say, he was extremely adamant on his refusal of such nonsense. I knew this instance was no exception. This he would turn furious, which is why I intended to tell him that this time I was going alone. But he slammed the table and shouted, "You'd just be fricking spoiling yourself for no damn reason. There is a woman at my workplace who couldn't have a baby, but she did everything right, like taking her basal body temperature and waking up at the right time every day, exercising, eating well, and staying away from certain foods. Her hard work paid off in the end, and she was finally able to have a baby, Frida. And what of you? You haven't done jack shit. Maybe you should your jogging time by 10 minutes, but by gaw, you're being so fricking rude to people who are really struggling with infertility by saying you want to go to the hospital when you really haven't done much at all." Dakarai's deep voice resonated across the entire house as he yelled at me loudly than he had ever yelled. It was terrible to bear. But I had no choice but to remain silent and listen to my husband's abuse. Because my husband's relatives, especially his father, were apparently giving him a pretty hard time to give them their long-awaited grandchildren. I was directly asked by Mrs. Chabang, my mother-in-law, once a month if I was pregnant or not, and it was left at that with me. But when it came to their son, they would evidently pressure him a lot more, and that would cause unnecessary stress for him. Dakarai had changed recently at work, in the sense that his jovial, jolly self was replaced by a dead-serious, silent hunk of pessimistic energy, and the cause of that because of the failure to conceive any children. I wished he would go back to being the kind husband he used to be. I knew it must have been hard for him too. I told myself to keep pushing myself for his sake, and I kept on trying. But if I kept on doing that, my physical and mental stress would eventually reach its peak. It did indeed, finally. Even though I wasn't pregnant, my period hadn't come for more than a month, and my body began to suffer from various health problems, such as dizziness, insomnia, and occasional upset stomachs. I told my husband that I was going to a hospital not to check for infertility, but for these assorted health problems, and consulted an obstetrician-gynecologist named Dr. Goldstein, who went on to examine me. He told me that if the cause of my stress was my infertility, I should have it checked out. I nodded my head. To be honest, my cycle being this irregular was pretty much the confirmation I needed, because I was somewhat convinced that I was the cause of our conception issues, and if the tests showed any abnormalities, those suspicions would be quickly justified, and I would be able to get proper treatment. I felt that we would never be able to have a child if things continued as they were, so I decided to have the test done without telling Dakarai. Besides, this is just a test to see if there is anything wrong with me right now. It was a part of the self-treatment I was doing on myself, so to speak, and I was doing all this for his sake as well as mine. Somehow I naturally thought of an excuse for my husband, and when I was told that the test result would be in a week, I went home. But there was no sign of Dakarai at home that day. I thought he was supposed to be off today, but he came home at night. But before I could greet me, he suddenly handed me what appeared to be divorce documents. which obviously confused me and made my eyes widen in shock. Wait, what's this? Why are you... I got my new girlfriend pregnant, so I'm divorcing you. I was so upset, but he went on to reveal the brutal truth. 6 months prior, because I was not getting pregnant at all, he started having an affair with a woman who worked in his workplace with the consent of Mr. Shabang, my father-in-law. And of course, the woman had also agreed to it. The woman was actually a childhood friend of Dakarai's, and my parents-in-law have known her and her family since she was a child. They were close as a family, and he told me that his parents even wanted him to remarry his new girlfriend instead of me, who was reportedly infertile beyond repair. And just today, they found out that the woman became pregnant within a few months of starting her affair with Dakarai. So to sum up, for the very reason that I was infertile, he had started having an affair with another woman, who also turned out to be his childhood friend, and got her pregnant. Needless to say, this entire story was absolutely insane, but the fact that it was real, and that Dakarai himself was sliding divorce documents in my direction right at that moment, left me stunned and silent. He went on to say he wanted a divorce because he didn't need me in his life anymore. You were the infertile one, and you always have been. He looked down on me as if he was mocking me. I finally snapped myself back to reality and understood everything that he was saying. This is a betrayal. I was able to yell back at him with as much fury and sadness in my tone as I could, but he didn't faze. Mio and Baba are going to pay the alimony, should you demand any, so you'll have to ask them for it all right? Oh, and by the way, no division of property because you're the one who wasn't physically able to have children. With that, he pushed the divorce documents in front of me. His section was already filled in, and without any options to escape the situation, I picked up the pen and took perhaps 20 minutes to write down a few pieces of information. My vision was blurry from the tears that were flowing down my cheeks. Finally. Now pack up your stuff and get the frick out of my house. With that, he shoved me out of the house and slammed the door behind him. I was shocked and stunned and had nowhere to go, so I had no choice but to return to my parents' house, where they welcomed me with open arms. I tried to tell my parents the whole story, but most of what I wound up saying to them were words of criticism towards myself. I was infertile, and that's why Dakarai is divorcing me. It was all my fault. I couldn't do anything right. And that's why he got another woman, his childhood friend, pregnant. When I put it into words, I realized once again how brutally Dakarai Chabangu had betrayed me. And by the time I realized it, I was sobbing my eyes out. I couldn't talk properly anymore because of how tight my throat was, and my eyes hurt because of how hard the tears were welling up and out. Dad, who had never seen me like that before, instantly turned furious and said, "We're going to hire a good lawyer and show those goddamn pricks who's boss," as he immediately started dialing a lawyer's office to collect a handsome amount of alimony. But when it came to the alimony, as Dakarai said, his parents were obviously going to shoulder it all for him, so that wasn't really a way to get back at him for what he did. I wanted to punish the bastard so badly, but I just couldn't, and I didn't know how to find a way. He had caused me so much pain, and now he's going to live happily ever after with a new woman and their child. I felt so miserable that I was completely depressed and secluded myself in the house for the entire week thereafter. A full week later, just before I was to see the lawyer Dad had referred me to, which was a childhood friend of his and became one of the most respected divorce attorneys in the city, I received a phone call. It was from Dr. Goldstein's office, the OB-GYN, where I went to get some fertility tests done, and they were calling to inform me the results were back. I scoffed at myself, as I already knew I didn't need the results anymore, but I figured I should at least know what was the cause of all those health issues I had, which had all strangely subsided over the course of a few days. So I headed to the OB-GYN before going to see my lawyer, Mr. Paolo. And lo and behold, according to the results of the tests, I could conceive a child without any problems. But I was also having irregular menstrual cycles, doctor. Are you sure there's nothing wrong with me? It is true that your cycle appeared to be disturbed when you came to see me the first time, but that was only due to stress, not because of your body constitution. The tests indicate there was nothing that could potentially make it difficult for you to have a child, and with the proper timing, you would get pregnant no problem. Dr. Goldstein handed me a piece of paper, the test results, and added, "I think the problem is most likely with your husband. My advice is that you discuss the situation with him and come back to see me together." At first I did not, or rather I could not believe his words. I was completely convinced that I was the cause of my infertility, but then I considered this. On what grounds? Where was the proof that I was ever infertile at all? I was merely brainwashed by Dakarai's ridiculous pride in himself. Right when I actually received the test results, I suddenly thought of something. There actually is a way to get revenge on him and his family. Now. It was as if my despairing world instantly regained its color. In other words, I had found my purpose in life, and a newfound hope upon which I could now use as a guide to do the right thing. And so, I set out in earnest to take revenge on my ex-husband and his family. After consulting with Mr. Paulo, and arranging a date a month after filing the divorce papers, a meeting was scheduled between my husband, myself, and both of our lawyers. Dakarai's lawyer was called Mr. Daunton, and he appeared to be a new lawyer, fresh out of law school. I wouldn't have been surprised if I was told that Dakarai was his first client. Meanwhile, Mr. Paulo had nearly 30 years of experience in the field, and therefore knew the ins and outs of the entire transaction. And unlike Daunton, who appeared very nervous and unsure of himself, Mr. Paulo was the very picture of confidence as he sat at the table, fingers crossed over a few envelopes and documents. He'd told me beforehand that he could handle everything on my behalf, but that wouldn't make me feel satisfied. I had to send Dakarai to hell myself. I entered the meeting room alongside Mr. Paulo, and I found Dakarai smiling triumphantly at me. He looked completely convinced that he was going to win. His side of the story was as follows, as per Mr. Daunton. My client admits to the affair, but it was inevitable because Miss Frida was shown to be infertile and additionally uncooperative in having children. Since both parties are at fault, he agrees to pay any amount of reasonable alimony, but strongly requests that the amount be reduced and stands by his claim that there will be no division of property. This was absurd. In other words, Dakarai's argument was that I was the sole cause of the infertility, which was founded on the premise that his new wife got pregnant with his child. However, the single fatal flaw in this argument was that Mr. Shabang had no evidence to support his claim of me being infertile. So, I confirmed with him that it was my infertility that was the cause of the whole thing. And he looked at me with a triumphant look on his face and said, "If you'd only had the damn baby, none of this would have happened. It's all your fault. For frick's sake, you can't even conceive a child, you lying whore. How dare you even stand up to me?" That's when I asked Mr. Paulo to give him a certain document that would provide additional information to this case. Mr. Shabang didn't seem to understand what the document was at first, but the moment he understood what they meant, his dark skin on his face began turning ever brighter. "What?" He instantly went deathly pale and started trembling. "To recap, you believe you two are both at fault here, because you admit you had an affair, and because you think my client was infertile, wasn't it? Unfortunately, medical examination proclaims there was nothing wrong with my client in the first place. Her OB-GYN, one Dr. Silas Goldstein, has told her that it was most likely a problem with you, Mr. Shabang, and that you, along with your ex-wife, ought to go see him again. Here's his written testimony. I must repeat, Mr. Shabang, it was you who was the cause of our misfortune in conceiving children, and there's nothing you can to deny it. There's no way. I'm infertile? Then the baby, inside of Martha. I suppose you can comprehend what's really going on here, Dakarai. You and I both know you're not stupid. You married another woman, who's most likely a certified scumbag herself because she did have the audacity to have an affair with a married man. No wonder she could be with someone else. Well, you had an affair too, so you can't really say anything to her without getting any backlash. I'm laughing uncontrollably, the despairing Mr. Shabang at this point. You said that I was an infertile failure, didn't you? But it was always you who was a failure because you were in fact infertile. Plus, you had the audacity to insult me earlier. Isn't that defamation of character, Mr. Paulo? I looked at my lawyer and he nodded slowly. What you said earlier was an affront to my client's dignity, And if she's been dealing with such abuse like that on a daily basis, then I must make my statement and claim you're completely at fault for the divorce. I'm sorry for what I said earlier, just a slip of the tongue. Even if you didn't say such nasty things, you can't argue that the divorce was because of my infertility anymore. You're at fault. I'll get a handsome amount of alimony and a fair share of your estate, Mr. Shabang. The silver lining is that now you can at least raise someone else's child. I said as I stood up and left the room. Danton bowed as we left the room. He may have lost, but he was respectable in the sense that he knew it was all over when that single document pulled the rug out from underneath his client's argument. I bowed in response and walked out. I honestly didn't think it would go this well, but Dakarai made the huge mistake of being stingy with his money and hiring an inexperienced attorney. I don't understand how he thought he could win with that weak argument, or how he could lash out like that in the presence of not one, but two certified lawyers. To say that he saw himself in a flower garden in paradise would be an understatement, and I really didn't want to be such a negative IQ fool like that. I cut off all contact with my ex-husband after that, and he seemed to be in a very tight corner thereafter. As you know, he is a proud man, and if his adulterous wife insisted that the child is not his, it was exactly the same as admitting that he is indeed infertile. But that doesn't mean that you can disregard it all under the rug to clear yourself of all doubt. It must be very painful for him from now on to raise a child whom he suspects is not his. The treacherous woman seems to consistently insist that the child is indeed Dakarai's, but it is still difficult to find out who the parents of the unborn child are unless the proud Mr. Chabangu took a fertility test. There is also the option of a DNA test, but Dakarai's Mio and Baba, who were very concerned with publicity and reputation, resented that option and are now pressuring their son to raise the child. Of course, blood is not everything, and there are many people who support each other as a family even if they are not related. But that's only if both parties have a good relationship. An adulteress who cheated on her husband and got pregnant with another man's child, and a president of a successful real estate company whose pride refuses to admit he is infertile and has to raise a child who may not be related to him by blood. If he's simply given in and gotten properly examined at the time that I also got myself tested, at least we would have had a clearer image of what was going on. But he rejected my suggestion out of hand and would not take the test himself. Without the test, we would not even know if he was completely infertile or if he was just difficult to contribute to conception. But at the same time, once the results were known, there was no excuse for him to say anything. And at the end of the day, I suppose he was just scared. What a pathetic man. I have been unaware of his true identity for 3 years. I can say that I am also at fault in a sense because it was more like I'd been feigning ignorance to that part of him. Well, I'm sure he'll try to divorce his current woman for some other reason, but the court case will be very complicated because of custody of the child and the child support that would inevitably be involved, not to mention the impact on the company's reputation amidst the public and the business domain. It's so ironic that he divorced me because he thought I couldn't conceive any me, and now he's going to live a very hard life because of a child. I hope he suffers for a long time, if not for his entire life, and I hope he knows hell as long as he lives. I hope so thereafter, and I got a handsome amount of alimony. Nowadays I'm living at home with my parents. I may be 30 now, but I'm not ready to give up on pregnancy and childbirth. I myself had been fooled by the old-fashioned, ridiculous saying that a woman's life is only until the age of 30. It was a mistake to think that what I thought was my potential had its origins in this idea. Nowadays, it is not unusual for a woman to give birth at 30, or even later. After my divorce from Mr. Shabang, I was surprised at how narrow-minded I was myself, and I am now doubling down to change all that. I was going to have a good love life, whether I was 30 or 40, and in order to hopefully meet the right person, I'm eagerly considering going to a matchmaking party next week. I can't think of marriage just yet, but I'd still like some kind of opportunity to prove myself as a capable wife and mother to a loving husband and children. With this in mind, I'm looking forward to living my life today.